podcast about product management, user experience design, technology, and more. This is Product by Design. All right, welcome to another episode of Product by Design. I am Kyle Evans, and today we have another great guest with us, Dr. Kenya Oduor. Welcome to the show, Kenya. It's great to have you on.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited about our conversation.
I am extremely excited. So let me give a brief introduction, and then we'll have you kind of tell us a little bit more about yourself. So Dr. Kenya Oduor is a human-centered researcher and strategist and solution designer, and trained in human factors, experimental psychology, and industrial engineering, and has started Lean Geeks, which is a business consulting and staffing firm. So that is a very brief intro. Kenya, we would love if you would tell us a little bit more about yourself and dive into some of your background, which is extensive, and I am so excited to hear more about.
Absolutely. So it's always funny when people ask you, tell me about yourself. It's like, where do I start? Yeah. So I made a career shift after undergrad. I was one of those on the 5-year plan because I didn't have it all figured out. And I went from engineering to psychology to physical therapy. And so a few years out of college, I was doing what I obviously didn't want to do. And I still had that passion or love for building things or creating stuff for people. And that's when I found the field of human factors. And so I relocated to North Carolina to get a graduate degree. And in that time, I had the fortunate circumstance of getting a position at IBM while I was a student. So it was an introduction to human factors psychology and the application of it in the software space. So this wasn't an intentional move on my part from a career standpoint. It was more of something that I stumbled on. I kind of kept going with it and learned how to communicate effectively with technologists and, leverage that systems thinking that I was really passionate about in the realm of software development. And so throughout my career, I was having a conversation with someone the other day about mentors and how my mentors are the ones that two people in particular who encouraged me to go into management and leadership. And I was like, really? So it was one of those things where someone else saw it before I did. And then once I got comfortable with the idea and started to explore opportunities, that's when I decided to step into from practitioner to leader in the space. And that opened up the whole world of kind of seeing things from the bottom up as a practitioner and from the top down as a leader, and understanding, strategy within organizations and how investment and decisions are made to determine why UX, how many UXers and what for, and that kind of thing.
Right.
So then I got that itch and I was like, I need to move on. So I go to another company. And then I said, you know what? I've always wanted to do my own thing. So I'm going to try out this entrepreneur world. And so I bootstrapped a business. My husband and I stacked hands that I had 6 months to get my first contract. And I got my first contract in 6 months. And so here I am 5 years later.
Wow. That is really, really awesome. And I feel like so many of us have come into product management and UX design by almost, stumbling into it. And that's kind of how my background was too, it wasn't necessarily something I was looking for, but kind of fell backwards into it. And because a long time ago, there wasn't a really established field for product and UX design. It was, much more of, I guess, the kind of thing that you stumbled into. And I want to dive into a lot more of some of the things that you touched on. But before we do that, outside of, the UX design and the user research and the human factors research that you do, outside of all of the work, are there other things that you enjoy doing?
I am very family oriented. So I love to spend time with family, love to eat. And so I guess just by the nature of loving to eat, I love to cook because I like to eat good food. And we have quite a few chefs in the family. So I spend a lot of time experimenting and coming up with stuff. And I love to buy new equipment like air fryers and Instant Pots and push the boundaries on, the things that I wouldn't expect to make in those kind of devices, but, try it out and see what happens kind of thing. So I like to spend a lot of time, doing stuff with the fam. That's my thing.
Awesome. That's great. Is there a favorite dish or a signature dish or something like that you would have?
So I love sweets. So I make a really good oatmeal raisin cookie, and a lot of people don't like oatmeal raisin cookies. And I have friends that anytime there's a get together, that's what they want me to bring. That and guacamole, which are two things that don't require a whole lot, but I have tried to share the guac recipe with other people and they can never replicate. Wow. So I'm not sure what it is, but I don't know.
Okay. That's really great. I love a good guacamole, and the fact that you get requests for your oatmeal raisin cookies, that's impressive, because those are the type of cookie that often get, they get ragged on a lot because that's impressive. So I wanted to dive into some of the things you touched on in your background and the work that you do in UX design, and you kind of touched on how you came into the UX field and the user research field. What really intrigued you about staying with it? You mentioned getting an internship with IBM and beginning your journey there. What really kind of kept you going once you got started?
It's a good question. I always look at I guess it's a really nice intersection of listening to people and having the opportunity to take what people say and what people do and looking for alignment, and having the opportunity to get to kind of the root of motivations and needs and that sort of thing. Because it fascinates me to kind of watch other people do their job and see where we've figured out how to get around some of the complexities of the tools we use or the parts of our job that are not optimal. I love to look at all of that and kind of then talk to people about it. But more importantly, like when you think about those conversations, to just walk away from a conversation like that with like oh, that's interesting, to me is not interesting. I'd rather have the ability to influence making it better. And so having had the experiences throughout my career where I am able to influence an improved experience for users, and that I can bring, so a software developer can write, really good code, and someone in marketing can really position it well. But I love to have the ability to influence that experiential aspect. And that experience can touch so many of those other areas like marketing and development and that kind of thing. So that's what's kept me going. And talking to people, I think everybody has a story,
Agree completely with all of that. And I'm interested in, you mentioned this on the transition from, going from a practitioner to a manager. And, that's a big leap for a lot of people in our field, and something that a lot of us aspire to, but don't necessarily always realize the full implications of, because it's a different skill set and a different set of responsibilities. So tell us about your journey in moving from, a practitioner within the field into a manager within the field.
So, and I think the way you've stated it is a really good example of where we go from practitioner to understanding how to manage people so that they can be effective practitioners. And for me, it was looking at what is the next step in that. And it's moving into being a leader and knowing that not only is my role to help manage the people in my organization, but it's to lead the entire organization around being human-centered or user-centered, and to find or to kind of pull out of individuals their uniqueness because we've all had managers that basically check the box and make sure we show up on time and, do what we're supposed to do. But leadership to me is more important in being able to get to know someone to the level, coaching them through the hardest times, because in working with other people, sometimes UXers have we get a bad rap, and it's so hard for us to work with product or the business and development. And we end up having to play like the middleman between the two. And so sometimes those skills of persuasion and negotiation and collaboration are the things that I think as leaders, we have an opportunity to help cultivate in UX practitioners. And I love your background, because what I've seen is so many people who were really good at UX from a practitioner standpoint, but then a strategic standpoint, were able to move into product management roles and to have an even greater influence on the direction and strategy. So, those are the kind of things that I see or saw as a part of my role. And I still take those, as a business owner, I sometimes forget that, I'm still a leader. And I should still oversee the team and the work in that same way, even though I don't work for someone else and I'm not getting my performance appraised and that kind of thing. I still owe it to the practitioners that, work for Lean Geeks, and that I still should emulate those leadership skills.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. What was maybe the biggest surprise that you found in that transition, in moving from kind of an individual practitioner into a leadership role?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that always comes to mind is no matter how far you go in stepping away from being a practitioner, to me, it's important to keep your skills sharp. So I made sure that if there was a project that, or even today, if there's a project that someone on the team is working on, I feel obligated to spend some time rolling up my sleeves and getting involved in things in some capacity, so that when I get into conversations that are more strategic or at a top-down level, that I can speak, intelligently to that particular space, that topic area, that user within that space, that kind of thing. So kind of keeping your hands dirty a little bit, to me, is important. Also, from a leadership standpoint, I think the hardest part is balancing what's right for your client or customer. So as the individual creating or being a UXer on something, that end user, balancing what they need and what's best for them with what's best for the business. That's also a difficult balance in terms of guiding the team around the fact that, this might not be the optimal solution for our users, but we've got to also balance that this is a money-making business that has to drive revenue. So those conversations can sometimes be difficult.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. That's really good. I wanted to touch on another point you brought up there, which is working across the disciplines. Obviously within product, so within product management and UX specifically, like you mentioned, you need to work across a whole bunch of different teams and groups and disciplines. What have you seen is some of the difficulties in that, and how do you overcome some of those difficulties, especially for UX designers and researchers in working with engineers or product managers or marketing or sales or whoever it might be? What are some of the best ways that you found to go about that?
One of the first things I've always stood by is to not feel, or to make others feel like, we're in this ivory tower of, I have a PhD and I know how to do this work and you don't. So just trust what we throw over the fence, kind of thing. That never worked for me. And so I've always seen engagement with end users as an opportunity for others to observe and to learn. And for those of us that have these specific skills, to use that skill to show others in the organization how to capture feedback objectively, or how to interpret what we've learned, that kind of thing. So I've always seen bringing others into the fold. If there are ways that you can empower a product manager or a business analyst to go and do some of this, discovery work on their own, give them some tools to help them do that. I can remember years ago, a junior product manager that wanted to go out and talk to some of the clients. He was asking me like, what kind of questions should he ask the prospects? And so he had a really hard time with asking questions that weren't too biased or pointed and that kind of thing. So I said, let's pretend like, one of us just got a haircut, and ask the other, like, you ask me, I just got a haircut. You ask me questions about getting a haircut. And so, he realized he should ask questions about what was the experience like? What did the stylist do that was different than the last time? What were my thoughts or feelings about that experience? And so he recognized that when we take and kind of look at that inquiry process and observational process, when we look at that around everyday interactions that we have with one another, there are ways to take some of those skills and use them in the way we interact with customers and end users.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So helping others, building them up, and teaching them about some of the same things. So it's not about being separate. It's about bringing everybody into the same capabilities and the same discipline of here's how we do UX together. And it's about all of us being part of the same group and the same ability to do it as one larger, more cohesive entity. That's really good. I love this. I feel like there's so many good things to talk about. And I want to touch on some things that you've brought up a couple of times now in your work throughout your career, and specifically in the work that you do in the company that you founded, Lean Geeks. You talk a lot about human-centered design and human-centered UX. Maybe you can build on that for us. Like, tell us more about that. What is it, and why is it so important?
I'm a little biased in terms of thinking that human factors is one of those really fascinating fields that every organization can use. Human factors is the study of work. And so when you think about work, I always liken everything that we do, social or otherwise, with technology or other tools and products. It's work, because you're trying to do something to accomplish something. And when you think about human-centered design, you've got to understand enough about people from a cognitive perspective and a physical perspective to understand that whatever ecosystem you influence or create, that in that you've got to accommodate the strengths and limitations that we have as humans. You've got to understand, are there certain, like if it's aging adults, what are some of the limitations that exist for that population? So having a human-centered design approach around things means that you're considering the whole human, and you're considering the fact that they're trying to get something done, fun or otherwise. Like there's a goal in mind. And so in that, you want that design to be conducive to them and to their needs.
Got it. That makes sense. And then how do you, within your work and within Lean Geeks and the work that you do, how do you help incorporate that into what you're doing, but also what other teams and other companies are doing?
So that's an interesting question, because the ideal client, from my perspective, is one that does not come to us just for us to go and get, go gather this information for us and throw it back over the fence so that we can, figure out what are the requirements, what are the priority of those requirements, that kind of thing. The teams that I really, really love working with are the ones that they want to actually learn some of these techniques. And when we walk away, they want to have something that they can rinse and repeat, and going back to showing others that are not in UX, or even that are in their UX organization, here are some techniques that you can use, even if you're not highly skilled or highly trained. These are just some things, basic things that you can do differently to get better results or better data. So I always try to find ways to educate at the same time as deliver.
All right. No, that's good. Going along those same lines, like, when does it make sense for a team or an organization to solicit help or to bring in like UX researchers or UX designers if that isn't part of their skill set or part of their organization or team? Like, when do you see that as being the right thing for you or somebody with that skill set to step in?
So I see like 2 or 3 like discrete opportunities. So if you're in an organization where, and we have several clients that come to us in this regard, is where you have a team of people who are junior researchers and designers, and you know that you need people who are more senior to help guide their work. That's been a huge opportunity for us, because these teams might be vying for projects of their own from their clients, but they might need to white label people from our team to be a part of their team, or they have work that they need to get done. And they know that in the current landscape, and right now we all know how hard it is to find talented people, that they might come to us and know that we can help them get through a project in that regard. Another opportunity I see is where an organization is trying to get objective feedback. Sometimes it's difficult to get objective feedback when you're doing the work yourself as the company. We typically go into projects and only mention our client. So we don't share with the people that we're observing or engaging with. We don't share who we're working for or on whose behalf we're doing this project or work. So that allows us to get that feedback sometimes about the client, where people might say, "Oh, I use blankety blank product and they suck." And that might be our client, but a participant, a panelist might not have framed it that way if they knew that someone from the company was doing the work. Yep. So I think that there's that objectivity that you can't get if you're doing the work yourself as the company. Even in the process of recruitment, you can't recruit people because they're going to know it's your company. So then they may either say yes or no based on that.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of going along those same lines, like, what are some other challenges that you've seen with companies when it comes to some of the human-centered designer research? I mean, you touched on just there the idea of getting objective research, but are there other challenges that you see as far as really incorporating, some of these principles and some of UX in general and some of this user research that companies struggle with, that you found to be some of the most common things?
If I had a nickel for every client that comes to us and says, "We have people for you to engage as panelists to use in this work," I'd be a rich woman, because they always promise us that we don't need to bake in time and cost around recruitment because we've got people. And then we sign the contract, and then either those people ghost them and have nothing to say to them or to us, or they actually dig a little deeper and realize either they're the wrong demographic or psychographic, or they're just not available. So that's one thing I think that has been a lesson for us, is to always have that conversation about baking in time and cost around recruitment, because it's not going to be as easy as you think. And for us, that's the hardest part of any project. So that's part of it. And then also, what we typically encounter is that organizations will have designers, and a lot of them have really good designers. Really good designers, my opinion, are those that are capable of also identifying the opportunities to validate their ideas or what they've created. Not every organization has the luxury of having individuals like that. And so sometimes they can get into this kind of rhythm of creating and thinking, we've created it and it looks good and it's done, without doing the work to also validate those ideas. So I think that's something that also comes into the conversation quite often.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I feel like even mature organizations from a product or design perspective can fall into the trap so easily of not properly validating. Building is so much easier than validating, because you can see the product of creating and launching features, whereas validating if what you've done is actually the right thing tends to be more difficult. So that makes a lot of sense. And then super interesting on the getting people for the research on that being, one of the key difficulties. I actually want to dive into that a little bit because you posted a really, really fascinating statistic. And, we were talking about this before we started because there's kind of two parts to this, that in getting people and individuals for research, it can be a really difficult thing, like you mentioned, but also making sure that the individuals that we have within some of our research groups, whether it's for user research or validation or whatever it is, are really representative of either the customer segments that we're looking for, or more broadly of the right population. And they're not skewed towards certain demographics, or it's not all, just the standard, I guess, white men, or whatever that might be, that we're getting a really representative group that can help us overcome what potentially could be biases that we build into our product. So tell us more about how we can do that, and what are some of the issues that you've seen with it, and then how can we overcome some of the issues that non-representative sampling can introduce into our products.
So if the work that you're doing in-house or in terms of your engagement with an external agency involves an advisory council, and that advisory council, I had a client years ago, they steered me towards their internal advisory council lead. And when I connected with that person and said, well, let's look at the demographics of your, like the range of demographics of your user or your market, let's look at that. And then let's compare it to your advisory council. She immediately was like, oh, well, then the conversation ends here, because our advisory council is on average, or is solely comprised of, on average, 50 something white males who are educated and make at least 80K. And so right there, and she's like, but we serve people who don't even have high school diplomas, who are Black and Latinx in rural areas. And so that's where my conversation with my stakeholders started, around the fact that there is a lot of bias that's just going to come in from people who have access to technology, people who are educated enough to understand terminology. There are things that are going to come out of this work if we just engage that advisory council that will not be representative of your market. And so in instances like that, that's where we have to do some of that grassroots recruiting of connecting with people in, Latinx credit unions, or finding Walmart managers that will allow us to put flyers in their break rooms, or people on Craigslist. So we have to find all these creative ways to recruit people. And the typical situation involves a referral process. So if you and I are two older Black women who are, not well educated, but we are strong in our church, if I get involved and I share with you or others in our church, you're more likely to trust me because of that connection and relationship we have through our church. So we leverage those relationships and connections in the work that we do around recruiting, because we recognize that you can't get to people through, those necessarily through a recruitment firm or the traditional means that you or I as educated people have access to.
Right. Yeah. So leveraging relationships and referrals sounds like a really powerful route to be able to introduce better representation. And that can be so important. What have been some of the pitfalls that you've seen, either companies or products that don't necessarily introduce better representation into their user research or into their validation if they don't do some of these things?
So if you think about certain markets, how they'll say an urban consumer market, there are needs that if you consider technology, so maybe it's some sort of cellular technology or something, if you're considering an urban versus non-urban community, and I hate to use the urban versus non-urban, but those are sometimes the classifications. And when you look at not engaging the one demographic, you potentially run into not considering, connectivity issues or technology needs or feature sets that are necessary for, I know years ago, I remember an example of an app that was created for people to report potholes in their community. And they could go and report the potholes on this app. And then the city would come and they would fill the pothole and that kind of thing, right?
Yep.
So when you think about the neighborhoods where the potholes exist, those are more likely not going to be the folks that have that app on their phone. And in the grand scheme of, job and food insecurity and a lack of resources, the potholes in your street might be the least of your worries. So when you think about the utility of an app like that, that's where you get into the haves and have-nots gaining access to resources because of that disparity that was baked into the whole concept itself of making it an app.
Yeah.
So you run into those challenges for sure.
Yeah, that's such a good example because I feel like there's so many different levels of it. I've worked on apps that have been for specific areas that are much lower technology fluency, and so we, as technologists, that's something that you have to just like get out of the building and realize that not everybody is tech savvy and has their computers. A lot of the folks that we were working with, they had to go to the library to use a computer, and that's what we were having to build for. And that's just, if you're not conscious of that, then you're just not building correctly. And like you said, if you even bring it back a level, there's building it in general. If you're not taking into account who has access versus who doesn't, then you may be building something that isn't going to do what you hope it's going to do, because it's not solving the problem as well as it could, given that the right people don't have access to it, where it could solve the most pressing problems. Yeah. So that's really, really good. And something that I feel like we just need to talk about all the time, because it's such an important subject. And if we don't constantly think about it and don't do the right research and right validation and build those things, then we will consciously or unconsciously build bias into our products and into our features.
So with that point, I think the very important point that kind of is a segue into the fact that if you don't have representation on your UX team, you now get into a position of not having the right folks in the room to kind of call out, hey guys, are we thinking about, or did we consider, that's where representation matters, not only in terms of your panelists, but also within your teams.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this was the statistic that you posted, and I'll read it real quick, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. That you posted this on LinkedIn, and we'll link to that post in the show notes. That African American / Black and Hispanic, Latinx, and Latino respectively account for 4% and 9% of user researchers in our industry, but make up 13.5 and 18.5% of the US population. So with that, how can we do better on our UX and product teams? Because obviously, like you said, having the representation in the room helps ensure that we don't have that bias flowing through, and that we can call out some of those things before they make it into our product, unconsciously or consciously. So what can we do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think hire for more diversity and be intentional about it. I think from the bottom up and the top down. So you've got to look at hiring practitioners who bring a creativity and a research perspective that might be very different than your own, that kind of thing. Or hiring from the top down in terms of leadership that's thinking more broadly in that way because of their lived experience. A lot of this goes back to our lived experiences. And I remember a coworker years ago. We were driving. She had broken her arm or her leg. And so I was driving her home from work every day. And so we would have conversations outside of work that we normally didn't have. but there was something going on. This was before George Floyd, and she was bringing to me, she was white. And so she was bringing to me how unfortunate this situation was. I can't remember what it was, but it dealt with a Black man and something happened. And so she would bring it up, day after day. And then finally one day she looked at me when I was driving and we were at a red light, and she said, "You know what? I've never actually thought about the fact that this might not be as shocking to you as it is to me." And I said, "You're very right." Because for many of us, we have the example of, uneducated or in jail or been to jail or on public assistance. Like we come from culturally, some of us come from culturally those different lived experiences. And so whether we ourselves live them and maybe we've, gained more education and that kind of thing, we still have that context to bring to our perspectives at work. And so, I think for her, that was an interesting kind of eye opener. But when you don't have that representation in your organization, it can mean either missed opportunities or huge misses in terms of doing things right.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I used to look at the fact that in a UX role, I was like a minority within a minority with just who I am as a Black woman in a UX leadership role. And it at some times in my career was very frustrating because of the interactions I had with other folks in the organization. But as a business owner, I now see it as a huge opportunity for me to leverage those differences in a way that if a client comes to my company, I have a huge opportunity to inject some of that representation and different ways of thinking that maybe they wouldn't have access to otherwise.
It's so good and so important, because if there's not that level of just different experiences and background, it can be so difficult to think through all of the various ways and impacts that a product can have or a feature can have, or just how other people will experience it. I mean, you can try to think through it, but I feel like there's no way without having the variety of experience and variety of backgrounds that you can even do that. And so ensuring that you have that within the team and within the organization, so that it's not a consistent like monoculture of everybody with the same background and same experience and same education and all of those things, because that can be I feel like it can be the path of least resistance often, because culturally everybody can get along, I guess, and you can build a team that's all very similar, but you don't get any of those different experiences and different perspectives. And it makes for, from a product perspective, a very, very difficult, at least in my experience, a difficult way to build and think about the UX. All right. Any other thoughts on that? I think it's such a great topic and really appreciate your perspective. So I guess any other thoughts on that subject in general, or ways that we can improve it?
I think it's about constantly asking questions and constantly asking ourselves, have we done the work that's necessary to ensure that we've reached the right voices in that work, even when it's difficult. When there's difficulty, it might be that you have to go about things in a creative or unconventional way to gain access to people. But have you done that? Have you even had that conversation? I think that's always important. And I always think of the fact that the more different everyone is in terms of backgrounds and educations and the context that we bring to a conversation, I feel like the more, as long as they're facilitated effectively, the more effective outcomes you can achieve.
That's a great point. And building on that, what have been some of the best ways to facilitate those conversations that you found?
So that's a good question. So the best ways to facilitate those conversations are, I've learned in my consulting career that it's even more important where you come into an organization and don't always know all the players and some of the nuances of the culture or the climate in that organization. One thing I found is you have to work very closely with your like primary stakeholders to make sure that they pull the right people into the conversations. Depending on the altitude and the outcomes you hope to achieve in a conversation, make sure that people who have ownership and input are in the room. But those that just have awareness don't always need to be present, because I've seen things go off the rails where someone's very much like, come on, come on, come on. We have to hurry up and get done. But we haven't even defined at a strategic level what it is.
Yeah. And
so I think for me, it's been a lesson in really the planning piece of things can sometimes be more important than the execution from a facilitative perspective. Also, when facilitating conversations, obviously, as you would with any sort of conversation, make sure that even the people who are quiet or introverted are engaged in some way in that conversation, because sometimes the best ideas come from the people who have who are the least vocal.
Yep.
And so I think that's always important in facilitation. And I also think that ensuring that you walk away from a facilitated conversation with things that are actionable is always important. So did you gain or get things that you can act on, even if it wasn't necessarily what you went into that conversation to get?
That's great. All right. Let me ask, what have been some of the best changes that you've seen due to good research or good design practices within either the companies that you've worked with as a consultant, as an owner of your own company, or as a leader within companies themselves? As companies or teams have adopted some of these human factors and human-centered design practices, what have been some of the best changes that you've seen as a result?
So I've seen where there was the identification of a white space within a software application market. And even though that software application at its core was like project management, essentially a tool to help you kind of manage a project to the end, what the research we conducted revealed was that in that project management, even if that project was the object that moved through that application, the most important aspect of that object was getting paid, and was billing and making sure you're billing accurately and that you're getting paid at the right time and you're not leaving money on the table. We would not have known that that was the focus and of the object as it moved through the application without going through that research. Another example was an experience where the product team presumed that giving people the ability to use the application, not only to manage the day-to-day tasks within their application, but allowing you to shop and make choices on different types of offerings within that application. They thought that giving users the opportunity to shop on a mobile device, and when I say shop, it's like the plan that you choose. Mm-hmm. They thought that we should give people the ability to do that shopping. But the research that we did, we found that people were like creating spreadsheets and making decisions based on like crunching numbers to see the overall kind of spend or investment that they'd have to make. And then they go and ask their mother for recommendations. So that was something like going and asking mom and then doing crunching numbers on a spreadsheet meant don't even put it in the mobile app. That was a whole big piece of work that they had sized and planned on their roadmap that needed to come off and allowed them to do things that were more important.
Yep. No, those are great examples. I love it. For those getting into UX and design and user research, who may be new to the field, what advice would you give to them, right now, starting out?
That's a good question. So the first thing is curiosity. If curiosity is not, and curiosity about people, if that is not how you are wired today, do not think that just by taking on the role of UX or the title means that you're going to become curious. The people I've seen that are really successful, whether or not they're really good at research or design, they're the curious ones because they constantly ask questions that help them course correct and get closer to the right outcome. So that curiosity, I think, is what you want to ask yourself. Do I really care? Not so much like care from an emotional standpoint, but do I really care to understand and analyze and ask more questions kind of thing? I think that there's also a lot to be said about experience. And with time comes experience. So, having spurts of like, I was here for 3 months and I did this, I was here for 6 months and I did that kind of thing, to me is not demonstrated experience, because you have to see something like through to the end to see what comes out on the other end and what the outcomes are. And that takes time. And I think a lot of people want to, go to boot camp, get a certificate and say, you know what, I need a job. I need to make 80, 90K right now because I did the work. But doing the work requires you to go through that whole kind of cycle of, what is it all the way to it's out the door. And those are probably the two biggest pieces of advice. Oh, another thing I think is that whether you have a background in arts or software engineering or something like that, sometimes those capabilities that you have are your platform, but that doesn't mean that you have to stick to doing design or doing software engineering. Those might be a catalyst for you to have effective conversations with others in your organization, for example, and use that foundation or that background as a tool and not necessarily your only tool. So you can gain those other skills maybe on the job or through additional training, but don't look at your degree as your only kind of path forward.
Those are some great pieces of advice. I love it. All right. I've got two kind of final questions, but before we get to those, any final thoughts on anything that we've talked about or anything that we haven't talked about?
I always think that the balance for any of us is in anything that we do. I mean, like if you get hurt, you can triage or take care of your injury at home, but there comes a point where you got to go see a professional or an expert. Mental health, same thing. The same thing applies to UX, research and design. There are some things you can do on your own, but there comes a point you have to be able to recognize that point at which you need to solicit the assistance or partnership with an expert. Sometimes that can be hard because we all think, I can draw a picture, I can, create some wireframes, when sometimes you need someone who has expertise in that to do it.
Yeah, it's so true. And it goes even for like really experienced organizations, that getting outside expertise, it makes sense, whether it's UX, whether it's research, whether it's any other kind of area within the organization, just getting outside advice and expertise to supplement, either to help do it or just to supplement like what you're already doing, just makes a lot of sense. And I've found that to be really, really helpful, whether it's just to augment the capabilities or to like really to supplement something that's really deficient. So whether or not you have it or whether you really, really need it, it helps a lot at various stages to add some additional team members or to get a lot more support, just depending on where you're at with your needs.
That's right. And sometimes we have to look at it like, you didn't know your mama's cooking wasn't any good until you went out and experienced someone else's. So it's kind of that, I think it's working. I think it's good. And then you experience, food somewhere else and you're like, well, maybe it wasn't as good as I thought it was. So you've got to make that assessment at some point.
Yes, so true. All right. Well, this has been an absolutely great conversation. I've got two more questions for you, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. But have you read or watched or listened to anything recently that you found particularly interesting or good?
Yes. So recently, someone recommended that I watch Young, Rich, and African on Netflix. And I was like, what is this? And so my husband is from Africa. So if it wasn't for being married to someone African, I would have what many of us in the US have as a context around what Africa is like. But watching Young, Rich, and African, I think it gives us all a glimpse into the variety of perspectives that exist in Africa. And, that's illustrative of any part of the world and what we perceive it to be based on what we're told or what we see here. But what I found really interesting, for it to be a reality show, the complexity and depth of the relationships and connections that they make. And, again, as a psychologist in UX, there was a lot in terms of the cultural aspect of community that you see in Africa, and the way that even for a controversial reality show, they showed a lot of depth in terms of being a community with one another. And that community piece, for us in UX, that community piece has as much to do with how people utilize technology and other services and that sort of thing, because those connections to other people have a huge influence on those things. So I watched the show not only for like the bling factor, but it was really interesting to kind of see the dynamics that existed.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. I'll have to check.
You got to watch it. Yeah.
That sounds good. Oh, awesome. All right. And final question. We'd like to do a shout out or a gripe. So is there any products or anything that you have used recently that you've enjoyed or disliked?
I'm not going to call anything out by name, but I can say that recently I don't know if it's because I'm getting older, but I have recently become a bit snobby about buying certain like utensils and appliances and things that you have to work with that are physical products that are not comfortable. And it's almost like in 2022, we should have the ability to create stuff that every time I use it, I'm not going to like prick my finger because I didn't handle it the way that, with care. I should be able to kind of move around and use it. And I realized that we still have a huge opportunity in the physical product space, just as much as the software product space, in terms of engaging our customer and making sure that things work properly.
That's a really good one. That things should be intuitive enough that you don't cut yourself for, as you just handle it like a normal person would handle it. Yes.
Yeah.
I love it. All right. Kenya, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you. This has been, we covered just so many great topics, and your expertise on all of them has been great. I imagine we could probably dive into each of them for probably hours more, just given how much research you've done and the experience that you have. So I really appreciate it. Where can people go to find out more about you, Lean Geeks, and anything else?
That's awesome. Thank you. So I want to say thank you again for this time. I enjoyed the conversation as well. You can definitely visit me on LinkedIn, Kenya Oduor, PhD, and that'll give you kind of pointers to YouTube videos and other content. And you can visit our website, leangeeks.net, and have a look and contact me or the team if you have any questions.
Awesome. We'll put those links in the show notes as well, so you can find them there. And again, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for the discussion today.
Thank you, and have a good one.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks again for listening. If you like the show, be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can follow the show on Twitter at prod_by_design. That's prod_by_design. You can follow me at Kyle Larry Evans on Twitter as well. If you want more product conversation, check out my newsletter, Product Thinking, at productthinking.cc. You can follow me on Medium at Kyle Larry Evans as well, or check out my Medium publication, Product by Design. Thanks again.